Margaret, one of our most popular guests. I'm glad to see you back again. People are already lobbying me to make sure that if we get MOATS America up and running, you are a big feature of that. Let me start, if I may, with what on earth is going on in Atlanta. Can you enlighten us?
Well, thank you so much for having me, George. The problem in Atlanta is that the police, the city police, the state police, are building something that is popularly known as Cop City, a huge police. They're calling it a training facility. It's something that is not needed. They are destroying an old growth forest in order to do it. Some of the last forests in that part of the state. People do not want it. People don't want to destroy the forest. They do not want this. It's like a military facility for the police, and there have been many protests about it. A couple of nights ago, a young man, one of the forest protectors, was killed by police. I do not believe the police version of events. They claim that he shot the police. No one believes this. There needs to be an independent investigation. So there are protests about this young man's death. And by the way, before he was shot and killed, any protesters were arrested and charged with terrorism for trying to stop this project. And it was all civil disobedience, all peaceful. But now this young person is dead, who speaking of what you were saying before, using the pronoun they. So this young person is dead. And there's a lot of anger about it, a lot of anger about Cop City, about a lot of anger about these terrorism charges, anger now about this person's death. So that's what's happening in Atlanta.
What about Monterey in California? Can you enlighten us anything on that?
I can't enlighten you except to say that this is a country full of unhinged people who also have access to firearms. There's nothing new to say here. It's the same old story. I can't explain it except to say this country has a history as a settler colonial state where people survive basically by subduing other people. That's something that has not been dealt with. And there are millions of Americans who do not want any gun regulation. They do not. So that makes it a difficult political issue to deal with on a national level because the country is divided about it. But the people who don't want regulations keep winning. And those of us who do keep losing. And we watch time and time again as an unhinged person who has a gun that I don't believe any common citizen has any reason to own, with large magazines that can fire many bullets very quickly. People can get their hands on these. And even in places here like in New York, where I am, where we have strict regulations, there are other states that don't. People will drive to Virginia, let's say, a few hours away, get their hands on anything they want, and they can bring it here or anywhere else in the country. So, every mass shooting seems to inspire more and more of them. So I'm sad to say that we can expect to see another story like this coming up. But we have political gridlock, we have a bad history, we have a lot of political cowardice also. And so it goes on and on and on.
Speaking of unhinged men with guns, you have a government full of such people. It is threatening some with guns. It is supplying other people with guns. No matter what the consequences seem likely to be. Another $2 billion this week in aid to the Ukraine, whose far-right and even Nazi formations are increasingly prominent in the state, as Zelensky's right-hand man told us this week after he had been dismissed. The power in Ukraine is in the hands of some of the most disturbing people on the planet. And yet the United States government is now bullying, for example, the German government to supply panzers to Ukraine to fight Russians. What could possibly go wrong, Margaret?
I cannot believe that no one understands why the Germans are reluctant. But unfortunately, they will fold because that's what they've been doing for the past year. But I also want to say that this violence at the top, the huge military spending, the U.S. adventurism around the world also inspires a lot of the violence here at home. You cannot be surprised that you have a violent country domestically when there's so much violence internationally. But the U.S. has this history. Lest we forget, after World War II, it was called Operation Paperclip, which brought Nazis, scientists, engineers from Germany to the US, and they were the people who laid the foundation for the space program. So the US has always been very flexible. It could be Nazis in the 1940s, it could be jihadists, it can be Nazis again in Ukraine. They don't really care who they partner with if it means they're going to get what they want. Ukraine has this history where half the country welcomed the Nazis in the 40s, where they celebrate the birthday of Stepan Bandera. It's an official holiday where people have marches. 2 years ago, White Lives Matter. They had a huge banner in English, White Lives Matter. This is a Nazi white supremacist state, but the US doesn't care because it thinks that they can counter Russia, they can shrink Russia, they can get rid of Putin, they can break it up, they can do something which is actually a fantasy. And these same people who have these crazy fantasies about Russia are also trying to target China simultaneously. So we have crazy people in the streets of the cities. We have crazy people in Washington who can endanger the entire world. And these tanks are useless. The Ukrainians, they're dragging guys off the street, literally giving them a couple weeks training and sending them to the front lines, who are not trained to use this equipment. So they have drained NATO nations of their weapons. They say Russia isn't running out of anything. Russia has manufacturing capability, but they have drained other NATO nations dry of weapons, but they will not let go. The U.S. sees this as an existential threat. They aren't content to impoverish European nations, to force them to buy liquefied natural gas. They are not content to have done any of these things, and I believe to have blown up the Nord Stream pipeline. They are now trying to force Germany to attack a country it attacked more than 70 years ago with a disastrous end.
Now, what do you think is going on in Washington, Margaret? The DOJ searched Joe Biden's house in Delaware for 13 hours yesterday. It has been revealed that he's the worst landlord in Wilmington, Delaware, charging his tenant $50,000 a month for a 3-bedroom house when the going rate is $2,200. And even worse, his tenant was his own son, the notorious Hunter Biden. What do you think is going on, and why do you think we're now learning of it? Is something going on?
Well, there are a lot of theories. There's, theories that there are people who don't want him to run again, and this is all part of a plot to discredit him and keep him from running again in 2024. I think it's leaked to Trump, where they made this very big deal about Trump having documents that, yes, he should have turned over, but there was so much overkill that it was a national security threat, that he was selling documents, that he should go to jail, rather than something that he should have handled but didn't. I think they then were afraid, or knew, that's another theory, Biden knew he had these documents and they started to look for them, but they found them before Election Day, before the midterm elections in November, but didn't say anything until after. And because a special prosecutor was appointed in the case of Trump, there's now a special prosecutor to investigate the president. So it's kind kind of mysterious, but it is, I think everyone can agree that Biden has been hoisted on his own petard, having made such a huge case over Donald Trump, and now will pay the price as he begins the process of, he says he's going to run again, which I think would be a big mistake for many reasons, but he has so far said that he will. And it remains to be seen whether, as this story unravels, whether he'll be able to do so.
Now, here's a hot potato for you, Margaret. We've got a poll running. Reparations for slavery, yes or no? It is dividing more than 10,000 people so far. Not down the middle. Most people say no. Substantial numbers say yes, but it's a very divisive issue. People say, well, first of all, there's no slave left alive and there's no slaver left alive. You can't punish generations for the sins of their fathers and so on. Secondly, they say, I have sympathy for this view myself, my ancestors certainly didn't have any slaves or profit from slavery. In fact, we were not much more than slaves to our own ruling elite ourselves. And the Irish half of me were actually amongst the first slaves in the Caribbean. I've met their children's children called redlegs, who were the first slaves taken to the Caribbean. What's your take as a black woman, as a progressive black woman? What's your take on this demand?
Well, I think the issue of reparations should not be confined to chattel slavery. We had a history for more than 100 years after the Civil War of what was known as Jim Crow segregation, which predominated in the South, but not just in the South. I'll give you an example of something that I'm talking about. After World War II in 1945, they passed what was called the GI Bill, which was meant to help war veterans, to help them buy homes, to pay for college, and so on. Black veterans were systematically cheated out of their GI Bill assistance. They did not get something that the law said they would have. And so they did not get to buy the property that others got to buy, that white people got to buy. They did not get the educations they should have gotten because of these very racist policies, which at the time were legal. So we can ask ourselves 70 some years later, are those people or their descendants not do some way of being repaired for the harm, the wrong that was done, which, by the way, is part of international law. There are UN charters saying that people are owed some way to make repair for wrongs done to people as part of a group. And these are things that the US has signed on to. So it's international law. These are things that I think most people would agree were wrong that had an impact. And I think we've got to go beyond slavery in talking about systemic policies that were intended to impact the lives of Black people and prevent millions of people from getting things that they were due. And I think it's time we had a serious discussion about how to right that wrong and how to compensate people, some of whom are still alive, who suffered from these losses and these wrongs because of official policy.
Now, your wonderful book about the presidents and slavery, I now have. Everyone should have it on their bookshelves. It is invaluable. The political class, including these so-called founding fathers, who are often prayed in aid as if they were the Holy Family, were actually themselves slavers. And even Lincoln, the man that freed the slaves, only days after the victory in the Civil War, turned his army to go and massacre the original Americans themselves. This is deep in the American political system, isn't it?
Oh, it is. It's foundational to this country. This is a settler colonial state where the original inhabitants were slaughtered, were killed, their land was stolen, they were killed deliberately by disease. Africans brought to the country as free labor. These are things that impacted the political system from the very beginning, with the first presidents all being either slaveholders themselves or defenders of that system. And as the decades go by, presidents who were unwilling to undo these wrongs. And we see many things that are wrong in our country to this day. And so, yes, thank you for mentioning my book, Prejudential: Black America and the Presidents.
It's a terrific book. I was just looking at a picture earlier today of the late and greatest Muhammad Ali visiting Lenin's tomb in Moscow some 30 years ago. This is, of course, the death anniversary of the Russian leader Lenin, 99 years, I think. Muhammad Ali was not allowed to micturate in the same lavatory bowl as a white man, even though he was the gold medal winning Olympic champion from Louisville, Kentucky. Now, I'm getting on. I remember those times. Not everyone does remember how late in history the United States was a Jim Crow society.
Yes, very. I mean, it's not that long ago. And I have to say this about Ali. His birth name, Cassius Clay, his parents named him after a white man who was an abolitionist, which is an interesting aside. But no, it is not long ago. It's within my lifetime. It's within the lifetime of you and millions of other people. But now there's still a lot of inequality in general. There's still racial discrimination. It's unfortunately not discussed enough. And we have a system which is very unkind to people, very ungenerous. And all of those things impact those people who are already at the bottom, are impacted more when you don't raise the minimum wage, when there's no national health system. All of those things are more impactful to those who were already suffering.
Always great to see you, Margaret Kimberley. Thank you for joining us.